Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, this is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and welcome to yet another Opentoonz news video. Now, be sure to stay tuned throughout the full duration of this video, because at some point in the video here, there will be a presentation that many of you have been waiting on for a little while now. But first, this story is something that most of you might be aware of by this point now, but Clip Studio Paint right now has an export option in creating Opentoonz scene files, which is a big step for Opentoonz when it comes to its viability in a commercial workplace. Right now, it's on discount at $87 compared to its normal $210 price tag. So regardless of if you're interested in purchasing Clip Studio Paint, or if you just find it to be some interesting information like I do, then that's just some food for thought. And that's just the first story of the day, and a link to this page will be supplied in the video description below. Next on the news is Storyboarder. Another link to this page will be supplied in the video description below. Storyboarder is a new open source means in which you can create some storyboards with a no-nonsense, simple interface. I'll eventually get into making a video about this at some point in time, kind of showcasing what this thing does, but it's definitely something that does interest me. Right now, it doesn't export as any sort of Opentoonz scene folders or anything like that, but seeing as it is open source, I can totally see something like that as being rectified at some point in time. Another thing that seems to be a future possibility for this program is camera control for the storyboarding in this program. Right now, the main focus of this program is to export it as a Photoshop file or as a PDF, but there's no reason why this can't get more fleshed out over time in the future. I do like the simplicity of this program, and a small child could easily work with this interface. I would recommend people to just play with it and just get a basic storyboard now, so feel free to check that one out. Now, the next story is about the style editor color wheel. It's fairly small. A lot of the time it's to the point where it's nearly unusable. The developers have been made aware of this, and it appears as though they may very well start getting this issue fixed in the future. A link to this page will be supplied in the video description below. Next on the news is an issue that's existed on Opentoonz for quite some time. Just look at this GIF on the screen right now. You can see that the end user is adjusting the sizes of the various windows on the screen, and then they change the size of the program window and pops it right back to being full-sized, and Opentoonz has messed up that window size customization. So basically, Opentoonz stores some sort of default window size that somewhat messes with your window size customizations, and this has been causing it so that every time you open Opentoonz, you have to first adjust a few windows, and then every time you change the size of the program window, you just have to adjust them again. So rest assured, the developers have been made aware of this issue, and it's likely this issue will be getting addressed in the near future. A link to this page will be supplied in the video description below. Next on the news is an update on my Critter-like assistant tool for Opentoonz. It's a bounty on Bounty Source, which is a place where you can go ahead and donate a little bit of money in order to get additional features put into Opentoonz, even to help fund a few bug fixes that may very well be irritating you. But this particular bounty is one that I personally created, and this will give us an assistant tool that's similar to what we've seen in Krita. Now, updates for this bounty source page has been basically featured in most of my Opentoonz news videos. The goal for this bounty has been set at $700, and I'm happy to announce that we're currently sitting at $600. So we're $100 away from getting this bounty fully funded, and once it is fully funded, we can expect to see the developers begin work on providing us with a new tool in Opentoonz as soon as the last $100 is met. So if you'd like to donate to this bounty, feel free to check the Critter-like assistant tool bounty source link provided in the video description below. Every little bit helps. Every donation is not only money that I don't have to personally pay out of pocket, but it's also a significant speed increase, which will give us this tool sooner than it would ever get to us if I was just the sole person funding this project. At my regular rate, we should be able to have this thing finished off within a month. Now, down here, we can see everyone who's donated to the project and how much has been donated. So far, special thanks goes to all of the following for their donations. JP Turkottle donated $23. Svepa donated $5. Richie donated $5. In the Sky donated $5. Open Anim donated $25. Agni donated $70. Tanty Danty donated $15. Peter Toy Bulldog donated $5. Trim donated $15. And JP Turkottle donated once again with an additional $22, which sets a total of $190 of the money in this project donated that I haven't contributed to the current $600 total. Like I said, every donation is not just money that I don't have to donate, but it is a speed increase towards getting this new feature sooner rather than later. So huge thanks goes to everyone that I just listed. You guys are making a huge difference, and thank you for your support. As soon as this can meet the $700 goal, development for this new and exciting tool will be able to start. And once again, none of this money is going towards me. All of it is going directly towards the developers. It's one of my dreams to get Opentoonz to not only stand as a free, full-featured animation suite, as it actually currently is, but to also make it so it becomes a viable option as a full-featured art program in general. I don't think it's quite there as a painting program quite yet, but I think that we can get there within time. Now, Agni is the guy who donated $70 to this project. Agni is the man responsible for us getting funding for the My Paint brushes that are currently in Opentoonz right now, today. And this brings me to my next story. Agni is currently in the process of trying to create a Kickstarter to provide us with some brushes and brush engines that are seen within Krita. And although we have a few brush engines within Opentoonz already, it's not really uncommon for a program to have a good, decent number of brush engines within it. And getting this would be a strong boost in favor of Opentoonz. He's been asking for my help with this Kickstarter, and although I'm willing to help him, the language barrier can be a bit of an issue to work through. So if someone knows both English and, well, I can't really be sure which language Agni speaks. It's either Russian or German. It'd be nice to get another party involved to maybe help translate our discourse. He's using probably Google Translate to try to talk, but the language barrier is proving to be pretty difficult. If you're interested in getting involved and you can serve as a bit of a linguist, please leave a comment in the video description below. Like I said, Agni is the guy responsible for the My Paint brushes, and he's currently trying to get more brushes for us. And it'd be nice to get people onto this to help, especially help him out. Now, the next two stories deals with impressive things that have been made in Opentoonz. Edward Benvines, please forgive me if I just butchered your name, has created this animation test that looks very impressive to me. And it's been made with Opentoonz. Here it is on the screen. You can see his cape moving and a fluctuation of light and possibly a subtle use of rain particle effects. I particularly found this interesting because it's imagery that could easily come right out of a cartoon meant for Ghost in the Shell, or maybe even Blade Runner. Now, this imagery is a collaboration with another artist, Peng Cheong. Again, forgive me if I butchered the name. Edward Benvines got permission to use this image right here, and he went ahead and made a nicely subtle animation here that I find to be absolutely phenomenal. Imagery like this is entirely possible with Opentoonz because, well, it's been done using Opentoonz, pure and simple, and a link to the animation and the image will be supplied in the video description below. The next story is oriented around how Opentoonz is currently being used commercially right here right now. Because the cartoon that you see on the screen right now is fairly professional, and it was made using Opentoonz. I look at this and I see professionalism, and once again, a link to this will be supplied within the video description below. As for the next story, earlier I was talking about how we need to have a help menu inside of Opentoonz, a functional help menu, and right now you're looking at it on the screen. A link to this specific page, basically what will eventually become the help menu for Opentoonz, will be supplied in the video description below. As you can see, it's very well organized. However, there are a few flaws to it. It needs to be edited, and seeing as it operates much like a wiki, it's very easy to edit. And here I press Ctrl F and type in Toonz, and here you can see that it refers to the program as Toonz Harley Quinn. This is just a copy and paste from Toonz Harley Quinn. So clearly we need to have some more things done with it. Not only that, but the Toonz Harley Quinn guide has only one thing that's superior to this specific help menu, and that is screenshots, images, pictures, things that help people visually actually see what's being discussed inside of the actual help menu. So if anybody wants to help out with improving this, feel free to join up and help out with that. And now for the main story that I've been eager to show you guys. For those of you that have been following my channel, this is the Vpaint presentation that I've been working on for the past month or so. But for those of you that don't follow my channel, you may be wondering what this has to do with Opentoonz. Well, when I'm confident that I can make a successful Kickstarter for $5,000, I'll essentially be making a Kickstarter in order to get a Vpaint level into Opentoonz. I've been trying to get solid vector fills into Opentoonz, and this led towards having an interaction with the developers working on the Marevna edition for Opentoonz. I started to receive questions like,
how do you want vectors to behave?
And this led me to scouring the internet and researching all sorts of ways other programs have utilized vectors and the various tools at your disposal while using them. However, Vpaint has an interesting way of interacting with vectors that no other program has offered in the past. In my mind, I see this as revolutionary, and hopefully you guys will agree. So what you guys are looking at on the screen is the web page that you can use to download Vpaint for yourself and tinker around with it. It's just a really bare bones demo, so expect to do a lot of tinkering with it and don't expect to create any true masterful works of art. Now, Vpaint is currently available for Windows Vista 7 and 10. Any prior versions it will not be available for. Now this is a downer for only a very small minority of people. To me, I don't see this as being a problem because if you're animating with something like Windows XP, I understand Windows XP was really reliable, but it's really old. It's been phased out by multiple versions of Windows at this point. As for Mac OS X, it looks as if it can work on Mac OS X. But you need to follow these instructions to get it to work. Don't ask me how, I don't know anything about Mac. As for Linux, currently, unfortunately, there isn't a package out for Linux. But if you know anything about programming, you should be able to compile it yourself. Once this is in Opentoonz, I'm sure there will eventually be a Linux distro using Vpaint. It's open source, so pretty much anything can be done with the code by anyone. Now, I'd like to get an idea as to how many people would be willing to donate and how much. Without this information, I'll have no idea as to if or when I'll be making a Kickstarter for this. So there will be a poll at the end of the video, so make sure that at the end of the video you look up at the upper right corner of the screen and be sure to fill it out. This is just me dipping my toe in the water and trying to see what the temperature of the water is before dunking myself completely in. Now, if you're just hoping to get a free tool and you put in that poll that you'll donate $100 or more or something like that, and you have no intentions of donating, then please don't participate with this poll, because if my Kickstarter fails, we'll probably never get this feature. I anticipate that even regardless of what I say, there's going to be a number of people doing that anyways. So I am keeping in mind that there are trolls on the internet, so if my poll rolls out with what I see as being unrealistic numbers, I'll completely disregard it. And if it's resembling realistic numbers, I'll try to generally just try to think level-headed about it. So let's talk about Opentoonz first, so that we can see the types of levels that currently exist in Opentoonz, and some of the features they have, but most especially how we can interact with vectors in Opentoonz right now. Because I'm planning on adding a Vpaint level, and this will help illustrate what it is exactly that I'm wanting to add into Opentoonz. First, we have raster levels. The raster level is interesting because you have access to a wide variety of brushes, most especially the MyPaint brushes, which were added into Opentoonz fairly recently in the Opentoonz Marevna edition and OTX. You can't use the fill tool or the fill brush on raster levels though, so there are limitations, but you have the most number of brushes and you have pressure sensitivity with this level type. But on Toonz raster levels, the levels wind up behaving quite a bit like vectors. However, there's no true pressure sensitivity with Toonz raster levels. It's able to recognize the difference from things that have been drawn with brush tool versus the things that you've used with the fill tool. So if I draw out a tic-tac-toe sort of object and fill in some of these squares with two different colors, red and green, I can fill this stuff in with the fill tool. But what's really cool about the Toonz raster level is that I can pull out the style editor and change the colors that we've laid down just by moving some sliders or messing around with the color wheel. So instead of the colors being red and green, they're now blue and purple, just automatically. Now, there is a scan level inside of Opentoonz, but I don't see any reason to show that level type off because I personally never animate with pencil and paper and scan it into the computer, so I'm not really an expert on that type. So let's get into showing the vector level. Let's discuss how vectors work inside of Opentoonz. So if we draw an X on the screen, we see that both lines exist independently of one another. They're also layered on top of one another. So if I create another style and change the color and draw out a red line, we can see that the red line is on top of the black line. However, if I press on one of the bracket keys, I can move it behind one of the black lines in order to change the stacking order. If we pull out the control point editor, there's a number of things that we can do with it. Upon selecting a line, a number of things appear. The white squares are called control points, and you can use them to morph around your image. Now, the purple lines that end in a point are called handles. You can move them around to control the arc of your stroke. You can press Alt and click on one of the control points, and it unlocks the handle so that they're no longer collinear. This allows you to customize shapes so that you can make a really sharp point with the control points. You can also select a control point and delete them, and you can also press Control and click on a line, and that'll create a new control point. With vectors, if we do the same tic-tac-toe experiment that we did earlier with Toonz raster levels, let's pull out the fill tool and fill in some of these squares. This is actually one of the biggest problems with Opentoonz at this point in time, because the fills interact rather irregularly. Here, I don't even do anything to the line, and then one of the colors just immediately disappears. The fills are highly unpredictable and unreliable, because even if you didn't do any edits to your image, it could very easily just decide to recolor your entire image at random. This is a huge problem, because if you have an animation with hundreds and hundreds of different frames, and at any moment the computer could decide to recolor 10 or 15 of them, you've already invested quite a bit of time to go through it with your first pass. So without even moving the line, the blue color randomly deleted itself from the square it was in, and once I start moving the line around, suddenly that same square now has a red fill for no reason at all. I've even had situations where a random line in the middle of a fill would magically allow my desired fill to continue existing. I had to turn it to a 0 color and 0 line thickness in order to get it to work. It was the stupidest thing I've ever encountered. Now watch it just randomly decide to color both boxes blue when all I really wanted to do was fill in a box, just one box, the middle square, that's all I wanted to color in. So there's big problems with Toonz vector levels. Now Turtletooth has done some great advances in trying to get this to work better, but in my opinion, I just don't see it ever working the way it should. This is easily the worst part of Opentoonz, and I appreciate and even applaud everything that Turtletooth is doing. He is, without a doubt, improving upon the system that currently exists. But I think that there is a specific cap. It can only get so good and still kinda suck. That's just my interpretation of things, just my time interacting with Opentoonz. That is my perception of trying to color your animation. We also have the pinch tool, which I never use, but it allows you to sculpt things with a good amount of accuracy. But if I pull out the control point editor and click here, you can see that it just created tons of control points. And the more control points you have, the harder it is for your computer to work on your animation without massive amounts of lag. People complain about there being too much lag when it comes to drawing vectors in Opentoonz. Well, too many control points equals a really slow drawing process. This is the problem with it. It's the cause of that. Now, as I'm about to enter into Vpaint to showcase it, you need to be aware of a few terms. First, right now, there are no control points to any of your lines inside of Vpaint. What Vpaint has is what's called vertices, and you can have no vertices on a line, or 2 vertices on a line. Now, lines and strokes in Vpaint are called edges. I don't see a problem with calling them strokes, but edges is the most proper term inside of Vpaint. Fills inside of Vpaint, or areas inside of Vpaint, are called faces. It's important that you adjust to this new terminology because I'll be using it throughout the course of the rest of this video. Now, let's jump into Vpaint. Upon opening Vpaint, you're greeted with this little pop-up right here, and it says the following.
Disclaimer: Vpaint 1.1.6, or any 1.x release, is considered a beta. It lacks plenty of useful features commonly found in other editor, and you should expect glitches and crashes once in a while.
So as you can see, just from the interface right here, it's a really bare bones program. You can't work on multiple levels, and it doesn't have a layers panel like what you would expect from something like Adobe Illustrator, and I actually feel as though that will become a necessity at some point in time. I don't think that it will be implemented immediately with this particular Kickstarter, but in time I can totally see us as implementing it over time. Now, it is possible that we might get a layers panel that's similar to what's inside of Synfig, because it's open source, but I can't really say yes or no. I can't really say anything about that because I don't use Synfig, and I've never really been acquainted with that layers panel. But I can safely say I really do like the layers panel inside of Adobe Illustrator. I like the way that you can group things. I like the way that you can just see the arrangement, the stacking order, everything. I like everything about how Illustrator's layers panel is. Now, first, I'm going to show you how you can get Vpaint to work like how a Toonz vector level works. Here, I can draw out an X, and we can see that both edges are independent objects. And it works with a layered stacking order as well. And you can change the stacking order by pressing the page up or page down buttons. There's 3 viewing modes in Vpaint, but it doesn't look as though they've been designated any proper names, so I'll be using my own terms for these viewing modes. There's the drawing viewing mode that we're in right now. There's a line thickness and vertices viewing mode, and we also have the vector stroke and vertices mode. As you can see, there's not a million control points everywhere. There's a vertice at the beginning and at the end of an edge. So let's suppose that we don't like having these 2 edges of this X be independent objects. What we can do is glue them together by control-clicking on both edges, and by doing that, you see some new vertices appear. We can select two vertices and glue them together by pressing G on the keyboard. Now we can see that we've created a solitary object out of this X, and there's some really cool things we can do with this. Now I click on these two big buttons at the top of the tool options, and this will allow me to draw edges and have it so that where any edges intersect with one another, they're automatically glued together as a solitary object. I also turn the snap threshold up to 6. If you put it up too high, your drawing won't come out the way you want it to. So 6 seems to be a generally decent way to go about this process. But ultimately, it's all up to you. So here, right now, I'm drawing out a pyramid. If we look at this in the stroke and vertice viewing mode, we can see that all the edges drawn share vertices, which means this is now one solitary object. Now, I demonstrate how the fill tool can recolor your edges, and now I color in the faces of the pyramid with different colors. Now watch this. As I extrude the center intersection point, we can see that our fills even follow a stacking order. This is why I feel we will eventually need to have a layers panel in Opentoonz, which lists the stacking order of objects and what things are grouped together. Grouping is also just as important, because it makes specificity to what it is that you're selecting. Because currently, without any of this, interacting with what you've drawn can be a bit of a nightmare sometimes. The grouping can be rectified to some extent, because if this were in Opentoonz, you could just put things in different levels. But like I said, when I make this Kickstarter, it's only and just to get Vpaint into Opentoonz. Getting a level strip in Opentoonz will be an entirely separate project. But once I move the central intersection point up and move the bottom edges and get the stacking order working the way I want, we can construct something that looks and feels like a three-dimensional object. Not just while you're watching the animation, but while you're actually animating it. Don't get me wrong, there's no point where you're actually making 3D models in Vpaint, or in a Vpaint level. You're just moving two-dimensional shapes around on a two-dimensional stacking order. However, what makes this unique is the revolutionary vector topography, which makes it feel, to some extent, as if you're able to visualize what you're animating as a 3D object. The efficiency of this sort of workflow isn't quite there, just simply because there's not a layers panel. So I can't recommend doing everything as if you're working with a 3D object, but it's still something that is possible. Now watch this. I select all of the edges and faces. I then press Ctrl-C to copy it. I then select this distant frame, and then I press Ctrl-Shift-V. And it may look as though I just pasted it, but it actually did what's called a motion paste. Now, I start changing the shape of my pyramid as if I'm shifting the perspective, and I have a little difficulty dealing with the stacking order once again, for the faces most especially. But what I'm doing is a fake camera movement, which involves the geometry of the pyramid shifting around with a small parallax effect. Think of this camera movement as if you're in a helicopter rotating around the pyramid. Faking camera movements has been done in animation software for a long time. I know people that are accustomed to using Flash had to do it for a really long time. As you can see, the stacking order of my faces are still a little weird in this animation, but I tinker with it a little bit more, and I get it to look just right. Again, having a layers panel in order to mess around with the stacking order of things would make things quite a bit easier, but even still, the workflow is still doable. Now, of course, there's perspective-related issues with this pyramid, but once my Cradle-like Assistant tool is fully funded and planted into Opentoonz, we'll be able to construct a different perspective grid to two different breakdown images, and we'll be able to motion paste the pyramid into both frames and sculpt it to match the perspective it needs speeds in order to match. You see where I'm going with all of this? Where all of this has been leading to? There's a scene in The Lion King where Mufasa is explaining to Simba that everything the light touches is his kingdom, and talks about the circle of life. The camera then rotates around them, and you can see that it was really testing the limits of 2D animation. With this, however, Vpaint, it wouldn't be taxing at all. And I really feel as though the Vpaint vector topography is exactly the sort of thing that would put 2D animation back on the map. Now, maybe sculpting your image through an entire animation isn't exactly what you'd want to do, but it might come in handy from time to time. It's up to the artist to dissect a good workflow for features like this. With motion pastes, it'd be nice to control the motion curves so that you have control over the speed in and speed out, and just generally control your spacing. Same thing with the in-between selection, but I'll get into talking about in-between selections in a bit. I still have a few more demonstrations to show with motion pasting. Now, just to recap really quickly here, with those two buttons at the top of the screen at the tool options, when they're turned on, if you draw an X, it'll merge both edges into one solitary object. You can detach them from one another if you'd like. After the fact, you're not committed to how you've drawn it at all times. And if you just deactivate those two buttons, then you'd be able to work with an interface that's very similar to a Toonz vector level inside of Opentoonz right now. Now, really quick here, I've already shown you that you can glue edges to edges, but there's more to this rigging process. I draw out a circle, and with no difficulty, I can fill it with a fill color. I turn off those two buttons at the top there and draw out two independent free-floating lines, so you can see that the lines and the circles move independent of one another. Now, what I'm able to do is I can change the viewing mode and control-click on the face, and now you can see two new vertices on the face. I then select the vertices and glue them to the lines that were free-floating, and we can now see that the edges are all functioning as one solitary object, and the two lines are now anchored to the fill. This is extremely powerful in creating a rig, or something like a rig. Now I'm going to show you something else with the same sort of workflow as my last little animation to showcase what this workflow can do. I draw out two skyscrapers as though we're in a helicopter looking down on the scene. Just imagine as though I draw out an entire city, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just drawing out two buildings. And then I draw out the second skyscraper. I deactivate those two buttons at the top of the screen so that my lines don't automatically merge with the first skyscraper in order to draw these three lines that are needing to be layered below the first skyscraper. I then change the viewing mode to make sure that everything is rigged properly. Unfortunately, if you have three vertices needing to be glued to the same place, you have to select them two at a time to get them glued. But I imagine this would be worked out at some point in time when it's integrated into Opentoonz. Even though I've drawn out objects with both of those buttons turned on so that edges will automatically be merged together, you still need to check their vertices because it's still possible that they might not have auto snapped together. Ultimately, in cleaning up your animation, you'd pretty much look over your entire animation and look over every single drawing independently, making sure each one is perfect anyways. And some people may argue that I'm spending so much time rigging and gluing this thing together. I disagree, because to make the in-betweens for the animation that I'm about to showcase, it would take far longer. The sort of perspective work that would be involved would be ridiculous. Some people may say that auto in-between tools tend to come out with a bad result, but you sort of do that with a 2D animation rig, with the edit tool and all that. And I can especially see this as being useful for static objects with shifting geometry, such as objects existing in a background. I'm not suggesting that Vpaint would only be good for backgrounds. I'm just saying that it'd be especially useful for some amazing animated backgrounds, and we'd have to find out a really good workflow for character animations as artists. Once I feel as though everything is glued properly, I start tugging on variously different edges to make sure things are connected properly, and pressing Ctrl-Z and then tugging on another one and pressing Ctrl-Z until I'm satisfied with how everything is and not running into any sort of issues. So now we have two independent objects. I pull out the fill tool and color these skyscrapers. Of course, I have some stacking order issues, and I actually had some difficulty getting these skyscrapers and their stacking order to work properly throughout the entire time that I was animating this thing. I motion paste these skyscrapers into another frame, and I select the top faces and then move them. Again, I need to keep messing with the stacking order to get rid of some of the glitchy behavior, but in the end, I feel as though even without a layers panel, this would still actually be totally worth your time. Once all of my troubleshooting is finished, I just select the top faces and move them, and it makes a nice camera angle. Just picture Batman on one of those buildings, and just picture what it would look like if we had the Critter-like Assistant tool to help make this look more realistic. And you can picture the awesomeness that this workflow can offer. Something like this done frame by frame, or trying to do it with rigs, like 2D animation rigs, forget it. It would just take too long. So here's my next demo. Some of this is sped up because some of this is a workflow that I've already shown you and you're already familiar with. And I go ahead and draw out a cylinder to represent a person's forearm. I didn't actually draw out a realistic arm and hand because Vpaint, as it is a very bare bones program, and I'm unable to draw out a rough animation first with a raster level, and I can't work with layers in general. But I can totally see how once Vpaint is integrated into Opentoonz, the feature-rich environment of Opentoonz would make Vpaint far easier to work with. So I draw out a very basic shape for a forearm and a hand with the fingers. I then double check how everything is rigged together. I pull out the sculpt tool, which is actually pretty powerful and very useful even. Holding shift with the sculpt tool and rubbing on an edge will smooth it. Pressing Ctrl or Alt will change the size of the sculpt tool, and it will also work like the pump tool in Opentoonz. It'll make it so that it changes the thickness of each edge so that they'll be thicker or thinner. I continue to use the sculpt tool to customize some shapes a bit. I then color the image and adjust the stacking order of various parts. I then select everything, copy it, and motion paste it on a distant frame. I then begin to sculpt the image about for the desired animation. Now, although the sculpting tool is fairly manageable, I would still like to have something like the control point editor in order to work with the Vpaint level. I then rearrange the fingers and put them in place. I sculpt them with the selection tool and the sculpting tool. I then review the animation, and I can see that the fingers are messed up with the stacking order. But for a basic animation, it's still not that bad, so I go ahead and fix the stacking order issue. I don't think that we'll be animating everything with the sculpting tools in Vpaint. I just think that we'd probably sometimes sculpt from one pose to just before another pose. Something similar to pose-to-pose animation. But now it's time to animate the forearm. Now the forearm has the radius and ulna. The radius rotates around the ulna, so the forearm should have some movement to it. But suppose you have muscles on this forearm. Now, this is a really basic animation, so I won't be able to actually draw out muscles, but I'll be showing you another feature called Inbetween Selections and do something kind of close to the sort of workflow that you would need in order to animate muscle movement. So I go ahead and deactivate those two buttons at the top of the screen, and I begin to draw out 3 lines. I then select the first line and go to the last keyframe and select one of the lines holding shift, and then I press I on the keyboard. I repeat this process for all 3 lines and actually continue with this process until I feel like I can clearly show how you cannot necessarily always sculpt select from one frame to another. Again, finding a practical use for this will be up to the artists to discover, and for whatever new features get introduced into Opentoonz to make these features more useful over time. I've tried a workflow where I tried using nothing but in-between selections. I found some difficulty with this sort of workflow, because when you draw two pictures independent of one another, you make different strokes, and different strokes going different directions, and that influences the animation with an in-between selection. It would really be nice to select various parts of two drawings on two different frames and be able to tell the program these are the same things, and having it automatically adjust the vertices to match one another and getting the direction of the edge stroke to match one another, and being able to do that incrementally so that making an entire animation with in-between selections could be a viable option. But I'm not a programmer. I don't know what all be involved with something like that. It's not really something that's included in the initial Kickstarter that I'm really shooting for right now. But suppose I was drawing out muscles with an in-between selection, leading to lines drawn with a 0 line thickness and with an applied 0 color so that it won't render. It would make it so that I could render more than just straight lines going across a cylinder. I could make actual detailed muscles rotating around. Now look at the end product of this here. I feel as though this is looking really good for a basic demonstration. Now let's move on to the next demonstration. Now earlier in the Discord chat there was a point where I described one of the features that Vpaint has. I might have actually spoken too soon, but with an in-between selection you can make an edge animate towards another edge, or you can actually have an edge animate to a vertice, or vice versa. In theory, you could be able to draw out an entire background and animate that entire background towards a single vertice to simulate the appearance of the camera moving forward or backward in space. But that is just in theory, as I came to realize while I was actually creating this demonstration. Basically, with this next demonstration, I'll illustrate some of the current limitations that Vpaint faces. But regardless of these limitations, the power of motion pasting and in-between selections is quite high. I can totally see the further development of this technology only getting better through time, which will eventually make it so that a Vpaint level can simulate the camera moving forward and backward in 3D space. Ultimately, I'm not too disappointed that this demonstration didn't work out, because if you want to simulate the camera moving forward or backward in space, you could just zoom the camera in or unzoom the camera. Just zoom it in, zoom it out. After all, that's what they did with the opening scene in Disney's Beauty and the Beast. Here, I use what's called split screen mode. This way I can see what's going on in two different frames all at once. This way, if I do an in-between selection or a motion paste, I have ready access to edit both frames without having to mess around with the timeline or the X-sheet too much. This can really simplify and streamline the process of animating. In either split screen, I have the ability to change what viewing mode I have accessible on either screen. So on the right split screen, my first goal was to make a vanishing point, and all I needed for that was one vertice, and just making a dot on the screen kept making a closed edge, which is an edge with no vertices. So I resorted to drawing out a straight line, and decided the right vertice was the vanishing point. I then motion pasted it onto the first frame of the animation. I then drew out a house on the first frame, made sure the house was rigged up well, used the sculpt tool to smooth out the lines while holding shift. I then eyeballed the perspective and drew out some of the other faces to the house and double checked that the rigging was just right. After the fact, I found that some problems still existed with this rig, but it doesn't really matter for this presentation because when you do an in-between selection, it doesn't preserve any of the rigging you've done to any of your lines. And there's nothing in the current interface that will allow you to preserve your rigging, and this demonstration will actually show this fact. I especially think that preserving your rig for an in-between selection would be entirely possible with a layers panel, because not only would that make the scene make more and more sense to you, the end user, but it may very well be able to make the stacking order of everything make more sense for the program as well. There is room for growth here. Not everything is perfect with Vpaint, it's just a beta at this point, but everything here shows the glint of massive potential. I first try to select everything and then go to the last frame, select the vanishing point, vertice, and I press I, but nothing happens. So I try animating only a few lines with an in-between selection, and that worked. However, notice how the vanishing point also starts to move. I think that that would be preventable with the hook tool in Opentoonz. I know that I haven't really discussed the hook tool in any of my tutorials yet, but then again, I haven't had any need to use it. I go to the other frames and I tried to move the vertice back to the original spot to reduce its movement, but in the end I decided that it really wasn't all that important. I also tried on multiple occasions to do an in-between selection of the filled faces, and that rendered no results. I continued to select more edges and use in-between selections to my vanishing point, and although I got a successful animation, nothing I could do would successfully rig the house to properly animate to the vanishing point. Sometimes vertices would be glued together with the in-between image, and sometimes not. So, with in-betweens, it's kind of unpredictable. Sometimes you can glue a vertice to something, sometimes you can't. I feel this unpredictability needs to be one of the first things that's fixed when we implement this into Opentoonz. At this point, I got frustrated with the work that I did, and I went ahead and pressed Ctrl Z a few times. I made sure that the rig on the first frame was just perfect, but as I went about for a second attempt for this animation, I realized that there was nothing I could do to preserve the rig for the entire animation, especially with the in-betweens. If the rig isn't preserved for this specific type of animation, you know, the fake camera movement, then basically the geometry of the building isn't preserved. It's just all wonky. Like I said, this fake camera movement isn't really a necessity, so the fact that this demo didn't really work out isn't that much of a concern. There's still plenty of uses for an in-between selection. Here, I tried to do an in-between selection from the fill to the vertice, but all that ultimately did was turn my edges red. Don't ask me why, but I'm confident these sorts of unpredictable behaviors will be able to get ironed out eventually once it's placed into Opentoonz. Don't expect it to be perfect once it's placed into Opentoonz, just expect it to eventually get there. So although this specific demonstration didn't work out, it did show me some things that I feel are important to consider, not just for me, but for you. It shows you what sort of workflow you can expect and what sort of workflow you shouldn't necessarily expect right off the bat. It also shows what the developers might possibly need to work on in the future. We as artists need to find out how these tools can best service us and where these tools can't really service us. And the developers need to find ways to make the tools more versatile, to possibly meet us somewhere in the middle. And now it's time to show off the 3D view. Now, Constantine is fairly confident that this is how we'll be able to control our motion paths and such like that. But by and large, Vpaint levels will be able to work like any other level in Opentoonz. The motion path with the stage schematic workflow will still be possible. But as it currently stands, I feel as though the 3D viewer in Vpaint is basically missing an entire interface to help customize arcs and such like that. I also feel as though the object morphs out of shape when you sculpt it sometimes. And this is regardless of if it's a in-between selection or if it's a motion paste. It's as if the program is interpreting the shape and it's just kind of misguided, which I don't really understand, because with an in-between selection, the vertices and the edges are basically in the exact same place. It's the exact same rig. Any type of alteration should be fairly simple for the program to interpolate. Sometimes it'll make decisions that don't really make that much sense. But with the 3D viewer, we can basically see all the in-between frames and the keyframes as well. And once you morph it, you can see a type of motion path, but it can't be sculpted in the 3D viewer, or altered, or modified, or anything. But here I'm just tinkering with it a bit, with no true animation in mind. I feel that customizing your arcs, your motion paths and stuff like that for Vpaint needs to be a bit more hands-on. But I feel that most of that sort of programming would need to be done after Vpaint is initially planted into Opentoonz. Unless, of course, if the project were to get some sort of overfunding. If it gets overfunded, I can totally see that we could very well be able to refine a Vpaint level quite substantially. And with overfunding, we might be able to get a layers panel in from the very get-go. But as it stands, don't expect all of that. Just expect to have what you see currently. But as it stands, this is the only place where I actually feel Vpaint is truly lacking. It feels like there's an interface that's completely missing. And although there's a number of tools and features I haven't shown off, I'm just showing off some of the more impressive features. Who knows, maybe some of what I'm complaining about does exist in Vpaint right now, but at the current moment in time, I might not really know how to work with it. Who knows? And frankly, Vpaint is such a basic demo and is kind of frustrating to work with. But once it's put into Opentoonz, I can see it being a much more pleasant workflow in many different areas, because Opentoonz is so feature-rich. Now, although I've shown some novelty presentations for Vpaint, you can still use Vpaint for a frame-by-frame animation. And in closing up this demonstration, and concluding this video, I'd like to mention that the person who made Vpaint actually has 2 videos of note that I have linked in the video description below. If you'd like to check those out, feel free to do so. But most especially, while in closing, please be sure to participate with the poll up at the upper right corner of the screen right now. That's what that little box is, and it's just going to ask you, would you be willing to donate, and it'll ask you how much. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to check out some of my other videos that are up on the screen right now, just feel free to check them out.